let's talk about you first, man. Then we're going to get into some of the world.
Yeah.
You, for anyone who may not be familiar with you, you went up against one of the biggest political powerhouses in the country. And, throughout your campaign, and I give you a lot of credit for this, you certainly had made an amazing effort and your staff made an amazing effort. But there was always a sense of you never tried to downplay what you were up against. You know what I mean? Like you never downplayed what you were like. You never were like, she's not like you never did. Like you were like, we're going up. This is David and Goliath. We're not going to try to sugarcoat this. That doesn't mean it's impossible. We're fighting for a win, but we know what we're going up against. And you never downplayed that. And so let's just start. You were not victorious, but what's your assessment as far as what happened and what you learned?
I'm super stoked, frankly, about the result. I've been in 3 elections: the 2018 primary, the 2020 primary, and then the 2020 general. And in each of those races, we more than doubled our count from before. So we just won 75,000 votes, which is nothing to shake a stick at. And in March, I won 33,000 votes. So at that pace, I am, if I maintain that pace with respect to the 2022 election, which I haven't, committed to yet, but I'm exploring. If I maintain that pace, I win the seat in 2022. So, and Ro Khanna took 3 races to win his seat, replacing long-serving incumbent Mike Honda. And he's a very similar figure to me in the sense of being a South Asian lawyer, very far to the left, representing a Bay Area constituency with a strong, particularly footprint among tech workers in the electorate. And he is someone certainly whose footsteps I'd be excited to follow and whose voice I've long been happy to support. And I see a template there that we're well into our process of replicating and executing. So I feel very excited. I do feel, among my reflections from this race, if I'm disappointed in anything in this particular, it is the media, because Nancy Pelosi has not debated an election opponent since 1987. The internet did not exist the last time Nancy Pelosi defended her ideas in public. And it's one thing for the incumbent to duck debates for 30 years. It's worse, though, for the corporate media to give them a free pass. And that is an institutional failing on the part of the corporate media, including MSNBC, CNN, Fox News, ABC, CBS, NBC, the San Francisco Chronicle. I could go on. Every single so-called news outlet in the country failed miserably, not only to conduct ethical journalism, and that's one dimension of it, but there's another way to look at this through a constitutional lens. The press has a constitutional function. And when it doesn't show up for work, it is not me as a challenger or our 30,000 supporters before, the 75,000 people who just voted for me. It's not us who are marginalized, though we are too. It is democracy that is marginalized when the press allows incumbents to escape accountability for their voting records. And if San Francisco had any idea how Nancy Pelosi supported the Trump administration over the last 2 years, I remain very confident that I would be serving in Congress this session. The fact that the media suppressed and didn't ever mention our campaign, just to be clear here, the online independent press was very, very friendly to us. And I'm very grateful for all the attention we got from folks like yourself, or Kyle Kulinski, or Rania Khalek, or Crystal Ball, or Katie Halper, Matt Taibbi. Lots of folks have been very generous with sharing my voice and our campaign's voice with their audiences. But in the local broadcast establishment in San Francisco, the only outlets that ever even mentioned that the sitting Speaker of the House faced a challenger from within the Democratic Party for the first time in the 30 years since she last showed up for a debate were the Pacifica Radio affiliate, which is predictable, and I've been a pretty frequent voice on KPFA over the years, and KTVU, which is a local Fox affiliate, which is to say every other television station and radio station in the city just did not show up for work over the course of 2 years. And the idea that human interest stories about, I choose the news that they found more important to share with people than that. But, I see a lot of people celebrating over the weekend because they see our democracy being, saved from the looming jaws of an aspiring tyrant. And I'm grateful for that too. I also see that the bucket of our democracy is a colander, because the aspirations of an aspiring tyrant, frankly, was only the most pressing among a whole litany of constitutional crises, and the failure of the press, I dare say the continuing failures of the press, are a big part of that. And, it's one of the things that gives me, to the extent I have any reservations about running in 2022, it is precisely my question about, whether the press is anything as an institutional lever that I or anyone else in this country can rely on. And,
well, you certainly can't. I mean, the press is concerned
indeed.
with upholding the status quo. I mean, you nailed it. I mean, they're owned by institutions like Comcast or Rupert Murdoch or, it's Jeff Zucker's wet dream. And they're concerned with upholding the status quo. And and as far as the weekend goes, look, my feelings have been nailed once again by an Onion headline.
Okay.
I'm glad Trump lost, but that happiness was quickly squelched by knowledge of a Biden win.
Indeed.
But anyway, but let's stick to your race in particular. Nancy Pelosi, did she ever even acknowledge you at all? Like, was there ever even just getting something wrong? Like even going like, yeah, I know I have an opponent like Sam Butter or something like that. Did she even do that?
Well, how she acknowledged us was caving on half a dozen policies. So there were a series of different policy issues, and I'll run through them in a second. But in each of these areas, Nancy Pelosi showed up well to her own left than she had been historically. And I take some credit for that, because I think our campaign, the threat we presented to her career, and the force of the social movements to which we may be served as a lever. So ultimately, when the Protecting Right to Organize Act passed in the House this spring, that was the biggest reform in labor rights in a generation, hasn't become law because of the Republican Senate. But for the better part of a year, it hadn't become law because Nancy Pelosi stood in the way. And labor unions asserted themselves. Our campaign stood with them in solidarity. And I think we acted as a lever to amplify their concerns, because we are the first campaign in 30 years that Nancy Pelosi has had to fear. And she abandoned her longstanding opposition to that bill and moved it through the House. Same story on saving the post office, same story on the Justice and Policing Act, parts of which I oppose, but many parts of which I've been advocating for over a decade. So she acknowledged us to that extent, but that's tacit acknowledgement, because it's not like she ever gave us credit for it. She just was stealing parts of our platform. The only acknowledgement she's ever had that she is running against anyone is her pretense, a false pretense, that she opposes Republicans. And you and I both know that in Washington, she facilitates Republicans. Right. She claims to her base that she fights them. And the one time she's faced by a Democrat, by not ever showing up for a debate, she basically suppressed and did everything she could to suppress any attention to our campaign. I'll give you an example of this. One way that she worked to actively try to suppress it. There's a local network in town, Resistance SF. They do, among other things, nighttime projection actions. Okay. In many cases, actually supporting goals that the incumbent Nancy Pelosi has supported. Like when she was impeaching Trump, they were doing actually very supportive things with her then. And at one point, they were projecting many messages related to our campaign, including our campaign logo on the side of the federal building in San Francisco. It was a dope action, incredible images, very stoked for it. And sometime forward, the federal building, and there's a FOIA request that shook loose the documents to discover that her office had a role in installing floodlights to try to basically suppress speech in the form of projections on the side of the federal building. And
how much more can you just be a villain? I mean, what the hell? Like, let's put some floodlights to the fuck this guy.
Well, what's the best part about the story, though, is so Resistance upgraded their projectors, and then they can still project on the side of the building. They just outshine the floodlights. So there's an arms race as to lighting on the side of the federal building between a bunch of grassroots activists supporting our campaign and various social movements, and the Speaker of the House, who, not for the first time and in the first way, but in a lot of ways, she actively suppresses speech, particularly by suppressing whistleblowers and keeping secrets out of the public view, that as a head of Congress, she's constitutionally obligated to fight for transparency. And as an agent of executive secrecy and in a lot of cases, crimes, I'm thinking of like CIA torture, right, or NSA surveillance, she is, let me put this another way. A lot of people see politics through a partisan political lens, Democrats, Republicans. I see politics particularly through a post-colonial lens and a constitutional lens, which is to see the reason I ran for the seat, and the reason I remain interested in making sure that Nancy Pelosi is retired as soon as possible, is because she ultimately, in the same way that Donald Trump, as an aspiring fascist, undermines the Republican democracy, she, as a head of Congress who is complicit with the executive branch and beholden to it, poses a constitutional threat to our democracy in the same way that the press not showing up for work poses a constitutional threat to our democracy, in the same way that a right-wing Supreme Court with lifetime appointments poses a constitutional threat to our democracy. We have a litany of challenges, though frankly, Trump was, I wouldn't say the least of them. He was probably the most immediate, but the others remain.
He was the most visible. He was the most just on the surface right there.
Right.
And of course, the others remain. I was laughing a little bit, not because of, of course, everything you're describing is absolutely horrible. I just love the aspiring fascist. You make it seem like it was like a job. He was like it was on a name tag for him, like Donald Trump, aspiring fascist.
Well, if he was in his second term, don't think he wouldn't put tyrant on a name tag with some gaudy uniform. He'd be dressing like Gaddafi or, Michael Jackson late in his career if he won the term. I mean, his inclination to pomp and circumstance and self-aggrandizement, I see the image you're constructing, and it's not far off of what I think we've just averted.
Well, and I don't want to go off on him too much, because there's just a lot of other stuff more particular I really want to talk to you about. But I had this theory that I was talking about like before the election, where I was like, if he wasn't a full blown just narcissist, he would want to lose. Here's why. First of all, neither candidate really wants the job. With what we're facing with the pandemic, like neither candidate really wanted the job. I'm not convinced Biden wanted it. And I know Trump never wanted it in the first place.
Right.
He didn't want it in 2016. So if you're Donald Trump, you look around, you're like, I am in over my head. I have no business being president. This sucks. What I really want to do, what he's always wanted to do when the end of the day comes, he wanted to start a TV network. So he's like, look, if I lose this thing, I'm just going to cry foul on every little thing. I have my own marketing team in place with like QAnon and all those folks. So they'll do all the marketing for me. Then I start a TV network. Who doesn't love a martyr story? I mean, it's a bullshit martyr story, but a martyr story nonetheless. And then he's going to succeed at what Sarah Palin failed at. He has his network. Folks like you and I and anyone with any sense of decency will ignore it. He'll have his fans, though, and then he's happy.
It would be the smart play for him. I mean, I think
he would totally want to lose.
It discounts the extent to which he has a just direct financial interest in staying in office, right? The flip side of this corruption.
He'll figure out other ways to make money. Come on, they're plutocrats. Sure, he enriched himself in office.
I don't disagree. I just need to say I think it would leave a lot of money on the table. And as much as he's a narcissist, he might be more greedy than he is self-centered. There's a question as to which of those values wins out, is all I'm saying. But
does a guy who claims bankruptcy 4 times always make the best financial decisions, Shahid?
Clearly not.
But enough about him. I want to get back to race. So
yeah.
So just to be like literal here, like she never even uttered your name, like just for like total, like she never. Okay, so
there is one time that her daughter did, though.
Oh, really? Was it right before blocking you on Twitter?
No, there was a New York Times article I woke up to in March talking about Christine Pelosi, Nancy Pelosi's daughter, who's a member of the DNC, the Democratic National Committee, calling Bernie Sanders to complain that Susan Sarandon had endorsed me. And it was like junior high school. The source
of all evil, Susan Sarandon.
It was like it. But what's so funny about it is it's like high school. But none of these people talk to me. I mean, I have a connection to Susan, but like Christine doesn't talk to me. Bernie hasn't endorsed me. Pardon?
You're the one they don't want at the table. That's why it is like high school, and you're the one they don't want at the lunch table.
That's right.
Susan Sarandon's not at the lunch table either, but they see her as a threat. She's at the neighboring lunch table where they can see her. And they're like, why do you like Shahid? Why do you like Shahid? We don't like Shahid.
And this was in the New York Times, but it was her daughter in a back channel that got reported. So that's the closest thing Nancy Pelosi ever got to acknowledging me, was her family reaching out to Bernie's team to try to complain about his endorsers also supporting me. And, I found that can I play that out though? Because there's an interesting story on the back end of that. It relates to Bernie Sanders not endorsing our campaign and why I'm proud of it, which is a little counterintuitive. Okay. So I ran for office inspired by Bernie, and he did not endorse our campaign. And one reason why I'm proud of that is I think I played a role in basically getting Nancy Pelosi off his back. So we know that there's a lot of profound ideological tension between the two. After this New York Times article, the timing was recent, so I'm going to get some of the timing confused. This was 6 months ago, but around that time, Bernie's on the debate stage. Michael Bloomberg, who Nancy Pelosi had previously welcomed into the race.
Great guy.
Don't get me started on Michael Bloomberg.
Michael Bloomberg.
Well, actually, when we come back to the Biden administration and the theme of inviting Republicans into the cabinet, which I hope we get to.
Oh, we're going to talk about that later, Shahid.
Right. But, Bloomberg will come in here, and so we can talk about him then. But so Bloomberg says in this debate that if Bernie wins the nomination, Democrats lose the House. And the next day, Nancy Pelosi, to her credit, says, Bloomberg, as much as I welcomed him into the race, is wrong. Bernie winning the nomination would not cost Democrats the House. And I think one reason she said that was that she did not want to poke the bear of Bernie, the Me Too movement, or the Not Me Us movement and the Me Too movement, and the movement broadly that our campaign represented here in San Francisco. And the challenge for Bernie here is that as much as our principles align, going back to where you started with our interview, I faced the steepest hill in politics, right? The win number in our race is 250,000 votes. I won 75,000 votes. That's enough to win most congressional seats across the country. But, because of the nature of San Francisco, Pelosi's depth, the ownership of the media, its control, as we were describing, and its editorial decisions, which frankly rose to the level of racism here. The most racist experiences I've ever had in my life, having grown up in rural Missouri, were at the hands of the San Francisco press. And we can come to that.
No kidding.
All kinds of things to talk about there. But
we'll talk about a few of the highlights. Give me a racist highlight reel, please.
Sure. Well, 48 Hills, which formerly was the San Francisco Bay Guardian, and they publish a set of endorsements every year. They and Broke-Ass Stewart, a grassroots blog that had endorsed me in 2018, both declared me in 2020 unqualified, which I find so amusing because, just to be clear here, I taught at Stanford Law School 20 years ago. I helped secure marriage equality as a federal right. I've led multiple nonprofits. My work's been cited by U.S. senators. Multiple members of the House have asked me to brief their staffs, and colleagues in the House have been arrested for an act of journalism in the U.S. Senate. I've published dozens of articles, and local journalists who don't have anything resembling, frankly, I think even an awareness of my work, apparently, went to the level of declaring me as journalists, members of the press, in official statements out to the public, that I'm unqualified. And any number of candidates of color have been denigrated in that way. What I find amusing about it, though, is just the obvious failure of fact checking. I'm not prone to, I'm not bombastic. My older brother is very prone to boasting. It's one reason I'm not. But just to be clear, and I mean this objectively, and I think it's a fair statement, I don't know many people who have run for Congress who are more qualified than me in terms of their background and work impacting.
Well, and what qualifications does Nancy Pelosi have other than her ability to fundraise?
That is her qualification.
That's another valid question to ask.
Well, and there's a corollary to that, because if that is her only qualification and I am somehow unqualified, that's the press punching down and insulating power that in a way that isn't just, institutionally racist towards immigrants challenging power, but particularly insulating power from accountability. It's the press at its worst. That's the press stooping to the level of basically acting as state propaganda. And the reason I describe it as racist is because it just disregards 20 years of work. And, to do that to an immigrant and to present to the public this claim, unsupported claim, that I'm unqualified. And that's the same thing. People said the same thing about AOC. People said the same thing about Ilhan. Anybody who challenges power is supposedly unqualified. And when you say that about immigrants of color, it has unfortunate dimensions. Or when the press, for instance, print hit pieces and then don't publish the stories about when various smears get debunked. All of these are, examples of racism that infects an institutional press here. And this is another point I'd want to make clear, that has borne no accountability for it. No one at the San Francisco Chronicle or 48 Hills or Broke-Ass Stewart has acknowledged their failures in printing the stories that they did, in failing to issue corrections, in not checking their facts. These are failures that remain effectively uncorrected. And I'm not, I'm running against Pelosi, and my concerns are the CIA and stopping wars abroad, not fixing the racism in the local press corps in San Francisco.
Sure.
But, as I'm talking about the holes in the colander of our democracy, it's among them. And it's one that, as a candidate, confronting an entrenched power holder in San Francisco, who, as you described, just did not show up for the obligation of presenting herself to the constituency, someone so entitled that she hasn't defended her ideas in public since Ronald Reagan was the president. Before Bush's father was the president was the last time Nancy Pelosi ever debated someone. And I just see that.
Well, I have a theory on this. I have a theory on this since you bring up the debate portion. First of all, I believe full-heartedly she knew who you were. She knew who you were. What I think we can look to as to why you were not granted a debate, we can look to AOC and Crowley. When AOC was granted a debate,
she destroyed him.
Well, not just she destroyed him. Yes, she did. She certainly destroyed him, and it was beautiful to watch. But what that also does, when you are an incumbent, especially a powerful one, especially one as powerful as a Nancy Pelosi, when you grant your opponent that debate, you do validate them. You say to general, and the press validates them too, and it says to a general voter, hey, you do have a choice. Do you want more of the same? Or do you want this person who has some new ideas, who has some different perspectives, who's speaking a language you might not have heard before? You know, I mean, it's easy for us in our progressive bubbles to think this is a common language, the language of Medicare for all, of a Green New Deal. And it's slowly becoming one. But there's still a lot of people where it's not that apparent that that's a choice. Absolutely. That's still a hurdle to overcome. And I think
they agree with that, but I wouldn't frame it as the incumbent granting anything.
No. I know. I meant that in like the metaphorical sense. Like from their end, they're like, I'm not going to do that because that's empowering my opponent.
Right. That's absolutely, you nailed it. I think that's right. I just think of it through, I think the lens maybe you do as well, that because you used this frame earlier, these are people, any person on a ballot is auditioning for a public role, and for incumbents to so presume their incumbency, to demonstrate the entitlement not to debate or acknowledge their opponents, you know, to try to obscure their records, and frankly coast to re-election, betting on the ignorance of the electorate, people not realizing that she funded Trump's concentration camps and handed him his military budgets and expanded his surveillance powers while limiting her so-called resistance to photo ops. If San Francisco knew that, there's no way that 200,000 people would have voted for her. They only voted for, 200,000 people voted for Pelosi because they fell for a ruse. And this is why I blame the press for not showing up, because again, that's not the incumbent's role. I mean, the incumbent, I think you're right, is correctly, or at least as not correctly, but strategically gaming the system. But the reason she was able to get away with that is because the San Francisco Chronicle, KQED, KALW, KPIX, the local ABC, NBC, CBS affiliates, none of them showed up for work for 3 years. And I do think that is.
Oh, absolutely. And I think part of it too, they didn't just rely on people not really knowing what Pelosi actually does. Of course they rely on that, but they also rely on people not knowing there's an actual choice. They want people to just think, oh man, Republicans, it's getting gruesome out there. Trump is a special kind of gruesome. We got to just stay with what we know. I don't know who this other guy is because there wasn't a debate. I just got to stay with what I know. I'm going to vote Pelosi. That's what I know. That's what they're relying on people to do. And Pelosi knows that.
Yep.
So she's going to do everything in her power to make sure that that stays the case. And one of the things she can do very easily is make sure she doesn't show up for a debate.
Well, it shouldn't be easy is my point.
I agree. I completely agree.
Right. If the press writes, and there was one story in the Chronicle a week before I was smeared for a whole bunch of things, but the Chronicle wrote one story about Pelosi ignoring calls for debate, and not a single broadcast outlet, picked that up, and that's how many people read the newspaper. It's disappointing to me to see the levers of our democracy crumble, and whether that's, again, the co-optation of the Supreme Court by a right-wing appointment, which I'll just drop, incidentally, was facilitated by Nancy Pelosi and Dianne Feinstein.
Yes,
two San Francisco Democrats.
They did nothing. There's so many. Everyone's like, well, the Senate, they couldn't have. No. They could have had bill after bill after bill that would have had to have been given precedents that could have stalled it. They could have just easily done. They could have been like, here's a funny bill, like whatever it was. They could have just thrown that at them. They could have brought up the whole impeachment thing. Remember that circus where they didn't look at Trump's real crimes? Which you were one of the few people who told that story of, hey, this is all the stuff they're not looking at because they're complicit in it. You know, they could have brought that up. They could have
Yep.
brought, I mean, so many things they could have done, and they tried nothing. Nothing. Like, were they guaranteed to for sure stop it no matter what? Not necessarily, just to be, you know, fair politically.
That's right.
But they tried nothing. Like, absolutely nothing.
Pelosi promised to use all the arrows in her quiver, and it was suggested to me that her arrows were all Nerfs, except they weren't even like, that's clever, except that my response was, that's charitable, because she didn't even have Nerf arrows. She didn't fire any. She used none of the tools available to her. And the point I want to make about not just Pelosi, but Dianne Feinstein, in her softball questions as the chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee, they are both Democrats, powerful Democrats representing San Francisco. Of all the cities in the country whose voices in Congress would pave the road to the right wing securing a generation-long grip on the Supreme Court, for San Francisco's voices to be playing that role, I am frankly offended by. It would be one thing for, you know, Houston, Texas's voices in Congress to be doing that, but for San Francisco, and I frankly think that the city should be aware of this, and I don't think, frankly, San Francisco has any idea. I don't think the rest of California, frankly, understands. Like, the role of this city is, frankly,
no, people think progressive. People think California is some progressive utopia, and there is no progressive utopia in the United States. There just isn't.
Yep.
Get your news on with Ron. Don't you want to know what's going on? We're getting our news on today. Get your news on with Ron. Don't you want to know what's going on? We're getting our news on today. Yeah, yeah, yeah. You can tweet me an article at Ron Placone. We'll go through it together and